James Lawson stood at the edge of his penthouse's glass wall. The city stretched out below him like an intricate mosaic of ambition and chaos. The Manhattan skyline, sharp and glittering, was a constant reminder of his achievements. His reflection in the window, trim, commanding, and meticulously groomed, was the very picture of power. Yet, as the city pulsed beneath him, James couldn't shake the gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion. At 45, James was living proof that wealth and determination could conquer almost anything. Almost. He had spent decades building Lawson Enterprises into a multinational juggernaut. Every corner office, every merger, and every headline bearing his name had been a deliberate step on his path to dominance. But in the silence of his penthouse, the accolades felt hollow. His empire was vast, yet it was built on solitude, on choices that had carved away pieces of his humanity. The persistent buzz of his phone interrupted the stillness. It was Evelyn, his assistant, a voice as steady and polished as the man she worked for. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "the investigator you hired has returned. Shall I send him up?" James's chest tightened, his gaze drifting toward the sleek black folder on his desk. He had commissioned the investigation weeks ago, driven by a restless curiosity he had been unable to ignore. Now, the answers he sought were here. "Send him in," James replied, his voice betraying none of the tension coiling within him. Moments later, a man with a professional air stepped into the room, carrying a sealed envelope. The investigator, middle-aged and unassuming, placed it carefully on the desk. "The report contains all the details you requested," the man said. James gave him a curt nod. "Thank you. That will be all." The investigator left, and James was alone again. He reached for the envelope, his hand hovering over it for a moment before he ripped it open. Photographs and documents spilled out onto the desk. His breath caught as his eyes fell on the first photograph. A boy no older than 10, with bright eyes and dark hair that mirrored James's own. The boy's name was Max Hayes. James skimmed the report, his gaze darting between the words and the images. Max lived with his mother, Sophie Hayes, in a modest neighborhood outside the city. Sophie worked as a waitress at a local diner, supporting her son on her own. James's throat tightened as memories of Sophie resurfaced, her fiery spirit, her unwavering independence, and the brief but intense connection they had shared over a decade ago. He hadn't known about Max. Their relationship had ended abruptly, with James prioritizing his career above all else. He had been young, ambitious, and selfish, blind to the consequences of his choices. For the first time in years, James felt unmoored. He stared at Max's photograph, his thoughts spiraling. How was he supposed to handle this? What could he possibly offer this boy who knew nothing about him? As night fell, James found himself unable to sleep. He paced the length of his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The photograph of Max sat on the table, a silent reminder of the life James had missed. By morning, he had made his decision. He couldn't ignore this. Whatever came next, he needed to meet them, Sophie and Max. The bell above the diner door jingled as James stepped inside, the warm aroma of coffee and pancakes enveloping him. The diner was modest and bustling, a stark contrast to the sleek and sterile world James was accustomed to. Families and friends filled the booths, their chatter blending with the clatter of plates and silverware. James's sharp, tailored suit drew a few curious glances as he made his way to the counter. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on her. Sophie Hayes. She stood behind the counter, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her movements brisk and efficient as she wiped down the counter. James hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had rehearsed this encounter in his mind, but now, faced with the reality of it, the words felt inadequate. He approached the counter, clearing his throat. "Sophie," he said. She froze mid-motion, her back stiffening. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. "James Lawson," she said, her voice flat and edged with disbelief. What are you doing here? The hum of the diner seemed to quiet as nearby patrons glanced toward the counter. James ignored them, his focus on Sophie's sharp gaze. "We need to talk," he said evenly. Sophie's laugh was dry and humorless. "Talk? After 10 years, you suddenly show up and want to talk?" James held her gaze, his tone softening. "I didn't know, Sophie. Not about Max." Her expression hardened at the mention of her son's name. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "And now that you do, what? You're here to play the hero, sweep in with your money, and make everything better. That's not what this is about," James said. "I just want to help. For him. For you." Sophie leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Help. Let me tell you something, James. Max and I have been fine without you. Whatever guilt you're carrying around, don't bring it here. We don't need you." Before James could respond, a small voice interrupted. "Mom." Both of them turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen was Max. His bright eyes darted between Sophie and James, curiosity etched across his face. James's breath caught. Seeing Max in person was different than seeing his photograph. There was a vibrancy, an energy that the still image couldn't capture. Sophie quickly moved to Max's side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Go back to the kitchen, Max," she said gently. "But who is he?" Max asked, his gaze fixed on James. Sophie hesitated, her grip on Max tightening. Finally, she said, "He's nobody, Max. Just someone I used to know." The words stung, more than James cared to admit. He watched as Sophie guided Max back into the kitchen, her movements tense and deliberate. When she returned, her expression was colder than before. "Leave, James," she said quietly. "You've done enough." James hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to explain, to plead his case, but he saw the fire in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness that wouldn't yield easily. Without another word, he turned and left the diner. Outside, the crisp autumn air bit at his skin. James stood on the sidewalk, his thoughts racing. Seeing Max in person had shifted something inside him. He couldn't walk away from this, not when he had a chance to make things right. James sat in the back of his town car, his fingers drumming against the leather seat. The ride back to his office was quiet, but his mind was anything but. Sophie's words echoed in his head, sharp and unforgiving. "We've been fine without you. Don't bring your guilt here." He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the one truth that kept him grounded. He had a son. Max wasn't a figment of the past or a mistake to be hidden. He was a boy with a life, dreams, and feelings, and James couldn't walk away. Not now. By the time the car pulled up to the Lawson Enterprises building, James had made up his mind. His assistant, Evelyn, greeted him with her usual efficiency as he entered the lobby. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," James said, striding toward the elevator. Evelyn blinked, clearly startled. "Sir, that includes the quarterly review with the finance team." "All of them," James interrupted. The elevator doors closed behind him, cutting off further protest. In his office, James settled behind his desk and picked up the phone. He didn't care if Sophie hated him. He wasn't giving up. He dialed the diner, his heart pounding as the line rang. "Betty's Diner, how can I help you?" The cheerful voice on the other end was jarring, a stark contrast to his mood. "I'd like to speak with Sophie Hayes," James said, his voice firm. There was a pause before the waitress responded, her tone less friendly now. "She's busy. Can I take a message?" James sighed. "Just tell her James Lawson called. I'll be stopping by tomorrow." Before the waitress could protest, he hung up. The next morning, James arrived at the diner again, this time with a clearer purpose. He didn't expect Sophie to welcome him with open arms, but he was determined to be heard. Sophie spotted him the moment he walked in. She sighed audibly, wiping her hands on a towel as she approached. "What now, James?" she asked, her voice weary. "I came to make you an offer," he said, keeping his tone steady. Her eyebrows shot up. "An offer? What? Are you trying to buy me off?" "No," James said, his jaw tightening. I want to be part of Max's life. I know I can't undo the past, but I can be here now. Let me help." Sophie crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Help how?" "By throwing money at us. We don't need charity, James." "I'm not offering charity," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm offering consistency. I want a co-parent. I'll support Max in whatever way you need. Financially, emotionally, practically." Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and laced with skepticism. "Consistency. You don't even know what that means. Your life is meetings, mergers, and money. Where does a 10-year-old boy fit into that?" James swallowed hard. "I'll make it fit. I've rearranged entire corporations to make things work. I can do the same for Max." Her laugh was bitter. "Max isn't a business deal, James. He's a kid. He doesn't need someone who shows up when it's convenient. He needs someone who's there, always." "I'm willing to be that person," James said, meeting her gaze. Sophie shook her head, letting out a frustrated sigh. "You don't get it. This isn't about what you want. It's about what Max needs. And right now, what he needs is stability. The kind I've worked my ass off to give him." "Then let me help you with that," James said. "Let me be part of that stability." Sophie hesitated, her resolve faltering for the first time. James could see the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to believe him warring with the part that couldn't forgive him. "Fine," she said at last, her voice tight. "You get one chance. But if you screw this up, James, you're gone. For good." James arrived at the park on Saturday morning, armed with a soccer ball and a head full of nerves. Sophie had agreed to let him spend a few hours with Max, supervised, of course. It was a test, one he couldn't afford to fail. Max stood beside Sophie, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. James felt his heart clench as he approached. "Hi, Max," James said, forcing a smile. Max glanced up at his mother, as if seeking permission to respond. Sophie gave him a small nod, and Max muttered, "Hi, do you like soccer?" James asked, holding up the ball. Max shrugged. "I guess. Well, how about we kick it around for a bit?" James said, trying to sound casual. Sophie stayed on the sidelines, her arms crossed as she watched them. James and Max walked onto the grass, the silence between them heavy. James set the ball down and gave it a gentle kick toward Max. The boy stopped it with his foot and hesitated before kicking it back. They fell into a slow rhythm, the ball rolling back and forth between them. "You're pretty good at this," James said after a while. Max shrugged again. "I play at school sometimes." James nodded, trying to think of something else to say. The minutes stretched on, the conversation awkward and stilted. But gradually, the tension began to ease. Max started kicking the ball harder, his movements more confident. James matched his energy, and soon they were running across the field, laughing as they tried to outmaneuver each other. By the time they finished, both of them were breathless. Sophie walked over, her expression unreadable. "Not bad," she said, her tone grudgingly approving. James felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The soft hum of James's car engine accompanied him as he stared out the tinted window, lost in thought. The outing with Max had gone better than expected, but Sophie's lingering skepticism weighed heavily on his mind. Her words, sharp and unforgiving, echoed relentlessly. He needs someone who's there, always. He was trying, but how could he prove he could be dependable when his own past screamed otherwise? Back at his penthouse, James sank into the leather armchair by the window, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The city sprawled before him in shimmering chaos, a world he had conquered but never truly belonged to. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, memories clawing their way to the surface. He hadn't thought about his father in years, not since the day he had walked out of James's life without a backward glance. James had been 12, just old enough to understand the weight of the empty promises his father had left behind. That was the day James had promised himself he would never depend on anyone. Relationships, emotions, attachments, they were liabilities. Instead, he He had funneled his energy into control, into building a life so solid that no one could ever leave him again. But now, here he was, trying to forge a connection with a boy who deserved more than half-hearted efforts. He had to be better, for Max's sake. The next morning, James found himself poring over articles and parenting guides, his focus razor-sharp. He wasn't going to wing this. If Max needed stability, James would provide it, no matter how foreign the concept felt. At the diner later that day, James watched Sophie as she moved from table to table, her movements efficient yet unhurried. There was a grace to her work, a quiet pride in the way she handled the bustling customers. When she finally approached his booth, her expression was wary. "What now?" she asked, folding her arms. "I want to know more about Max," James said. "What he likes, what he needs. If I'm going to do this right, I need to understand him." Sophie raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Why? So you can impress him with some grand gesture and then disappear again?" "No," James said firmly. "Because I want to be here. For good." She studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Fine. Max loves art. He's got a sketchbook he carries everywhere, always drawing something. He also loves science, space, animals, you name it. But don't expect him to warm up to you overnight. He's cautious, and he's got every right to be." James nodded, absorbing every word. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Sophie said, her voice softer now. "Just don't mess this up." James walked into the art supply store, feeling out of place among the aisles of paintbrushes, sketch pads, and colored pencils. He had spent the last few days learning everything he could about Max's interests, and now it was time to put that knowledge to use. A store clerk approached, her smile warm. "Can I help you find something?" "Yes," James said, glancing around. "I'm looking for supplies for a 10-year-old who loves drawing." The clerk's eyes lit up. "We've got a great selection of beginner kits, watercolors, pencils, markers. Does he have a favorite medium?" James hesitated. "I'm not sure. Let's get a bit of everything." By the time James left the store, he was armed with a bag full of supplies and a renewed sense of determination. The following Saturday, James arrived at the park again, his bag of art supplies in tow. Max was sitting under a tree, his sketchbook open on his lap. Sophie stood nearby, her arms crossed as usual. James approached cautiously, holding up the bag. "I thought you might like these," he said, setting it down beside Max. Max glanced at the bag, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "Open it and see," James said with a small smile. Max pulled out the supplies, his eyes widening. "Whoa, all this is for me?" James nodded. "I figured you might need more stuff for your drawings." Max looked up at him, a flicker of something, gratitude, maybe, crossing his face. "Thanks." They spent the next hour sitting under the tree, Max sketching while James watched. Occasionally, Max would show him a drawing, his enthusiasm growing as James praised his work. By the time they packed up, Sophie's expression had softened. She didn't say much, but James could tell he had passed some unspoken test. James settled into his office, the view of Manhattan doing little to calm his nerves. For weeks, he had carefully cultivated moments with Max, each interaction a step toward bridging the 10-year gap between them. Sophie's skepticism had softened slightly, but he knew it would take more to earn her trust. As he sifted through reports on his desk, Evelyn entered, her typically calm demeanor replaced by unease. "Mr. Lawson, there's something you need to see," she said, placing a tablet in front of him. James frowned, picking up the device. His stomach twisted as he scanned the headlines. Lawson Empire rocked by scandal. Secret family allegations surface. His blood ran cold as he read on. The article detailed his connection to Sophie and Max, painting him as a corporate magnate trying to buy his way into their lives. Photos of James outside the diner accompanied the piece, alongside speculative commentary on his motives. "Who leaked this?" James asked, his voice like steel. Evelyn hesitated. "I suspect Gregory Hunt's team. The timing is too convenient." James clenched his jaw. Gregory Hunt, his long-standing rival, had always been eager to exploit any weakness. This wasn't just an attack on James's personal life. It was a direct threat to his empire. "Schedule a meeting with the legal team," James said, "and have PR prepare a statement. I want this handled immediately." As Evelyn left, James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been careful to keep his efforts with Max out of the public eye. Gregory's interference risked not only his business reputation, but also the fragile progress he'd made with Sophie and Max. Later that evening, James arrived at the diner, his presence drawing uneasy glances from Sophie's co-workers. Sophie met him near the back door, her expression a mix of anger and exhaustion. "What the hell is this?" she asked, holding up her phone. The same article James had seen was pulled up on the screen. "I didn't leak it," James said, his voice firm. "This is Gregory's doing." Sophie scoffed. "So now we're just pawns in your corporate games?" "I told you, James, I don't want any part of this." "I didn't want this either," James said, stepping closer. "But I'll fix it. I promise you. I'll make this right." Sophie shook her head. "You don't get it, do you? Max doesn't need this kind of attention. I don't need it. You showing up here, bringing this chaos into our lives. It's exactly why I didn't want you involved." James's chest tightened. "I'm doing everything I can to protect you both. Then maybe you should walk away," Sophie said quietly, her words cutting deeper than she realized. James looked at her, the weight of her mistrust heavy in the air. "I can't," he said. "Not now. Not ever." James stared at his phone, his fingers hovering over the call button. He had spent the entire morning dealing with legal teams and PR consultants, but his mind kept drifting back to Sophie's words. He needed to prove that he wasn't just a source of chaos, that he could be the stability Max needed. With a deep breath, he dialed Sophie's number. "What now?" she answered, her tone weary. "I want to see Max," James said. "I want to show him that I'm here for him, no matter what." There was a long pause on the other end before Sophie sighed. "Fine, but this is your last chance, James. If you mess this up, you're done." That weekend, James arrived at Sophie's apartment, a modest two-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. Max greeted him with cautious curiosity, a far cry from the guarded boy James had first met. "I thought we could build something today," James said, holding up a model rocket kit. Max's eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" James said, smiling. They spent the afternoon piecing the rocket together, James fumbling through the instructions while Max patiently corrected him. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, and the two of them carried the rocket to the nearby park for its first launch. "Ready?" James asked as Max held the remote. Max nodded, his face glowing with excitement. "Ready." The rocket shot into the sky, leaving a trail of smoke behind it. Max laughed, the sound pure and unrestrained, and James felt something inside him shift. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. As they walked back to Sophie's apartment, Max turned to James, his expression thoughtful. "Are you going to leave again?" Max asked, his voice small. James stopped, kneeling to meet Max's gaze. "No," he said firmly. "I'm here to stay." Max nodded slowly, his trust in James growing inch by inch. When they reached the apartment, Sophie was waiting at the door. Her eyes softened as she watched Max excitedly recount the day's events. "You did good today," Sophie said quietly as James prepared to leave. James met her gaze, a flicker of hope sparking between them. "I'm not giving up, Sophie. Not on Max. Not on us." Max sat on the floor of his room, his sketchbook open on his lap. His pencil moved in quick strokes, shaping the outline of a rocket against the paper's stark white background. The memory of its launch earlier that week played in his mind, bringing a smile to his face. It had been a good day, maybe one of the best. He paused, glancing toward the door. His mom was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. It was rare to see her this calm, and Max wondered if it had anything to do with a man who had suddenly appeared in their lives. James Lawson, his dad. Max's thoughts raced as he added details to his sketch. He had always wondered about his dad, especially when kids at school talked about their fathers taking them to ball games or helping with homework. His mom had never spoken much about James, brushing off his questions with vague answers. But now, here he was, real, present, and trying. Max didn't know what to make of it. James seemed nice, but there was something guarded about him, like he was always holding part of himself back. It made Max hesitant to let his guard down too. "Max, dinner's ready," his mom called. He closed his sketchbook and padded into the kitchen, the smell of pasta filling the air. His mom smiled at him as she placed a bowl on the table. "Did you finish your drawing?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Almost," Max said, twirling his fork in the spaghetti. He hesitated, then added, "Do you think he'll come back?" Sophie's smile faltered, her expression unreadable. "He says he will," she said carefully. "Do you believe him?" Max pressed. Sophie sighed. "I don't know, Max. But if he keeps showing up, maybe we'll have our answer." Max nodded, her words echoing in his mind. A few days later, James showed up at the diner just as Sophie was finishing her shift. He waited outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. Max was the first to spot him. "Hey, Mom, he's here." Sophie followed Max's gaze, her lips tightening briefly before she nodded. "Go get your bag," she told Max. When Max returned, James was waiting with a small smile. "Ready for today's adventure?" he asked. Max grinned despite himself. "What are we doing?" "It's a surprise," James said, his tone conspiratorial. They ended up at the city's Natural History Museum, a place Max had always wanted to visit but never had the chance. His excitement was palpable as they explored exhibits on dinosaurs, space exploration, and ancient civilizations. James watched Max with a mix of awe and pride. The boy's curiosity was infectious, and for the first time, James felt like he was truly connecting with him. "Can we come back here sometime?" Max asked as they left the museum. "Anytime you want," James said without hesitation. Max looked up at him, a small smile spreading across his face. Sophie watched from the doorway as Max sprawled out on the living room floor, his sketchbook open in front of him. His pencil moved with intent, shading a dinosaur he had seen at the museum. "How was it?" she asked, sitting down on the couch. "Awesome," Max said without looking up. He said we could go back anytime. Sophie nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. James had been consistent so far, but she couldn't shake the fear that it wouldn't last. The next time James came over, Sophie invited him inside. It was a small gesture, but it didn't go unnoticed. "Coffee," she offered, her tone neutral. "Sure," James said, his surprise evident. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy. "You're doing better than I thought," Sophie admitted, her eyes fixed on her mug. James raised an eyebrow. That almost sounded like a compliment. "Don't let it go to your head," Sophie said, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I mean it, Sophie. I'm here for the long haul, for Max, for whatever it takes to make this work." She met his gaze, the vulnerability in his voice catching her off guard. For a moment, she saw past the polished exterior to the man beneath, the one who was trying to make amends. "We'll see," she said softly. The weeks that followed brought small but significant changes. James started attending Max's school events, showing up to soccer games and parent-teacher meetings. He learned how to navigate the everyday chaos of being a parent, from packing lunches to helping with homework. For Max, it was like having a new piece of his life fall into place. He still approached the relationship with caution, but his excitement at seeing James became harder to hide. Sophie, too, found herself softening. It wasn't easy to forget the pain James had caused, but seeing his efforts chipped away at the walls she had built. One evening, as they sat in the park watching Max play, Sophie turned to James. "You've come a long way," she said, her tone tinged with reluctant admiration. James smiled, a rare sense of peace settling over him. "We all have," he said. James sat at the head of the conference table in the sleek Lawson Enterprises boardroom, his calm facade masking the storm brewing inside him. Across from him sat Gregory Hunt, his longtime rival, whose smug expression made it clear he was relishing the recent tabloid scandal. So, Gregory began, leaning back in his chair. "I hear you've been keeping some interesting secrets, James." A son. Quite the twist. James's jaw tightened. "Let's skip the games, Gregory. We both know you orchestrated that leak." Gregory's grin widened. "Oh, come now? Don't give me that much credit. The public loves a good family drama. I simply made sure they got the full story." The room was silent, the tension thick. James's legal and PR teams exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for his response. He took a slow breath, then leaned forward. "You think you've won?" James asked, his voice low but firm. "You think this stunt will shake me?" Gregory chuckled. "Oh, I don't think. I know. You've always been untouchable, James, but now you're vulnerable. And I'm going to exploit every crack in your perfect little empire." James met his rival's gaze with steely determination. "You're going to regret underestimating me." Later that night, James reviewed the evidence his team had gathered against Gregory. Over the years, Gregory's greed had led him to cut corners, bribe officials, and engage in shady business practices. It was all there, buried in the data, but it wasn't enough to ruin him. Not yet. James needed more. The next morning, he arrived at the diner earlier than usual. Sophie greeted him with a wary look as she wiped down the counter. "Rough night?" she asked, nodding toward the dark circles under his eyes. "You could say that," James replied, sliding into a stool. "Gregory Hunt. He's the one who leaked the story about Max." Sophie's jaw tightened. "Why would he do that?" "To destabilize me," James said. "He thinks he can use this to destroy my credibility." "And?" Sophie asked, crossing her arms. "What are you going to do about it?" James's lips pressed into a thin line. "Whatever it takes." Sophie studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't trust you, not entirely. But if this guy is a threat to Max, you deal with it. Fast." Her words were sharp, but James detected a flicker of concern beneath them. It was a small gesture, but it gave him the strength to press on. The days that followed were a whirlwind of strategy and preparation. James worked tirelessly with his legal and investigative teams, piecing together the evidence that would bring Gregory down. But even as he navigated the cutthroat world of corporate warfare, he made time for Max. One afternoon, James picked Max up from school, his car waiting outside the gates. Max hopped in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hey, kiddo," James said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "How was school?" "Good," Max replied, pulling out his sketchbook. "We learned about planets today. Did you know Jupiter has more than 70 moons?" James smiled. "I didn't." "Which one's your favorite?" "Europa," Max said without hesitation. "Because they think there might be life under its ice." James nodded, genuinely impressed. "That's amazing. Maybe one day you'll be the one to find it." Max grinned, his excitement contagious. "Maybe." That evening, James sat with Sophie in her living room, watching Max work on a science project. The room was small but warm, filled with the hum of Max's chatter and the faint aroma of coffee from the kitchen. "You're good with him," Sophie said quietly, breaking the silence. James turned to her, surprised. "I'm trying." She nodded, her gaze softening. "I can see that. Just don't let him down." James swallowed hard. "I won't. I promise." The confrontation with Gregory came to a head a week later. James presented his findings to the board, a detailed expose of Gregory's corrupt dealings, backed by irrefutable evidence. The room erupted in chaos as the truth came to light. Gregory's smirk faltered for the first time. This is a smear campaign," he stammered. "You have no proof." James held up a folder. "Everything is here. Every bribe, every forged contract. You wanted to exploit my vulnerability, Gregory. Now it's your turn." The board voted unanimously to remove Gregory from his position. As security escorted him out, James felt a wave of relief. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the battle for trust, with Sophie, with Max, was far from over. That evening, James returned to Sophie's apartment, exhausted but triumphant. She opened the door, her expression unreadable. "It's done," James said simply. "Gregory's out." Sophie nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. Max appeared behind her, holding his sketchbook. "Hey, Dad, want to see my new drawing?" James's heart swelled at the word Dad. He crouched to Max's level, his fatigue forgotten. "Of course I do." Max held up the sketch, a detailed depiction of Jupiter and its moons, with Europa glowing in the foreground. James ruffled his son's hair, pride and love intertwining in his chest. "That's incredible, Max," he said. "Maybe one day we'll see it together." Max beamed, and for the first time, James felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The school auditorium buzzed with energy as parents, teachers, and students filled the rows of seats. The annual art showcase was one of the most anticipated events of the year, and the stage was set with an array of vibrant paintings, sculptures, and sketches created by the students. James stood near the back, scanning the crowd. His tailored suit stood out in the sea of casual attire, but he didn't care. His focus was on Max, whose work was featured prominently in the exhibition. Sophie approached, her expression a mixture of nerves and pride. "He's excited," she said, glancing at James, "but also a little nervous. This is the first time he's had both of us here." James nodded, his gaze softening. "I won't let him down." Max stood by his artwork, a series of pencil sketches depicting planets and their moons, each one more intricate than the last. He wore a name tag that read Max Hayes, grade 5, and his face lit up when he spotted James and Sophie approaching. "Mom, Dad," he called, waving them over. James's chest tightened at the word Dad. It was still new, still precious, and every time Max said it, it felt like a victory. "This is amazing, Max," James said, crouching to get a closer look at the drawings. "You've got real talent." Max beamed. "Thanks." The teacher said mine might get picked for the district competition. James exchanged a glance with Sophie, who smiled. "I'm not surprised," she said. "You've been working so hard on these." As other parents and students passed by, Max proudly explained the inspiration behind his work, his confidence growing with every compliment. James watched, a swell of pride filling his chest. When the formal program began, Max's teacher took the stage to announce the standout pieces from each grade. For 5th grade, the winner of the Judge's Choice Award is Max Hayes for his series Moons of the Solar System. The audience erupted into applause as Max made his way to the stage, his smile radiant. James clapped louder than anyone, his heart swelling with pride. Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she watched her son accept his ribbon and certificate. When Max returned, he handed the ribbon to Sophie. "Here, Mom. This is for you." Sophie knelt to hug him, her voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart. This is yours. You earned it." Max turned to James. "Thanks for coming, Dad. It means a lot." James crouched to meet his son's gaze. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." The car ride home from the art showcase was filled with laughter and conversation. Max's excitement was contagious as he recounted every detail of the event, from the snacks at the concession stand to the judges' comments on his artwork. "I can't believe I won," Max said for the 3rd time, his grin stretching from ear to ear. "You earned it," Sophie said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "All those late nights paid off. And you're just getting started," James added. "Who knows where your talent will take you?" Max nodded, his confidence bolstered by their encouragement. Later that evening, James stayed for dinner at Sophie's apartment. It was the first time he had joined them for a meal, and the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. Max dominated conversation, talking about his favorite planets and the books he wanted to read next. As Sophie cleared the table, James stood to help, carrying dishes to the sink. "You don't have to do that," Sophie said, raising an eyebrow. "I want to," James replied, rolling up his sleeves. They worked in silence for a few moments before Sophie spoke. "He's really happy, you know. I haven't seen him this excited in a long time." James smiled. "He deserves to be happy. So do you." Sophie hesitated, her hands stilling over the sink. "I wasn't sure you'd stick around," she admitted. "But you've proven me wrong." James met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I meant what I said, Sophie. I'm here for the long haul." For the first time, Sophie didn't look skeptical. Instead, she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. As James prepared to leave later that night, Max ran to the door. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked. James crouched to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "If it's okay with your mom, I'd like to." Max looked up at Sophie, who nodded. "Okay," Max said, grinning. "See you tomorrow, Dad." James's heart swelled as he left the apartment, the word Dad echoing in his mind. James sat in his office late at night, staring at a photograph of Max proudly holding his judge's choice ribbon. It was a snapshot of a moment he would cherish forever, a reminder of how far they had come as a family. But as much as he had worked to earn Max's trust and Sophie's cautious acceptance, shadows from his past continued to linger. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out a faded photo of his father, a man he hadn't seen since he was 12. The image was old and creased, the only tangible reminder of a man who had left more questions than answers. James had spent years bearing the pain of abandonment, channeling it into his career. But now, as a father himself, he couldn't ignore the parallels. The next morning, James made a decision. He needed closure, not just for himself, but to ensure that Max would never feel the same sense of loss that had defined his childhood. James reached out to an investigator to locate his father. The process was quicker than he expected. Within a few days, he had an address, a modest house in a small town upstate. Driving through the quiet streets, James felt a mix of anticipation and dread. When he finally pulled up in front of the house, he hesitated. The man who had shaped so much of his life, through absence, not presence, was just beyond the door. Taking a deep breath, James knocked. An older man opened the door, his weathered face lighting up with recognition. James's throat tightened. "Hello, Dad." Inside, the conversation was stilted at first, both men dancing around the years of silence that stretched between them. "I saw the news," his father said eventually, "about your company and your son." James stiffened, his guard immediately rising. "You've been keeping tabs on me?" "Not much," his father admitted, looking down at his hands. "Just enough to know you've done well for yourself." The bitterness James had buried for years resurfaced. "If you were curious, you could have been part of my life. Why didn't you?" His father sighed heavily. "I made mistakes, James. Big ones. By the time I realized how badly I'd messed up, I thought it was too late." "It wasn't," James said quietly, his voice laced with a mix of anger and sadness. "But you decided it was." The two men sat in silence for a long time before his father spoke again. "Don't make the same mistakes I did, son. If you've got a chance to be in your boy's life, take it. Don't let anything stop you." James left the house with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't let history repeat itself. James returned to the city with a renewed determination, but his father's words weighed heavily on him. He had come too far with Sophie and Max to risk losing them now. At the diner, Sophie noticed the tension in his posture immediately. "Rough day?" she asked as she refilled a coffee cup at his table. "You could say that," James replied, offering a faint smile. "Want to talk about it?" James hesitated. Sharing his past wasn't something he was used to, but if he wanted Sophie to trust him, he had to let her in. "It's about my father," he began, his voice careful. Sophie sat down across from him, her expression curious but patient. "I found him," James admitted. "I hadn't seen him since I was a kid. Walked out on us when I was 12. Sophie's eyes softened. "What happened?" James took a deep breath. He said he thought it was too late to fix things, that he didn't know how to come back. He looked down at his hands. "I spent my whole life making sure I didn't need anyone. But now, with Max, I realize I don't want him to feel like I did, ever. Sophie reached out, placing her hand over his. You're not your father, James. You've shown up for Max. That's what matters. Her words were a bomb, but James knew he still had work to do. Later that week, James received an unexpected call from Max's school. There had been an incident on the playground. A group of older kids had teased Max about the news articles, calling him the rich boy's son. When James arrived, Max was sitting in the principal's office, his head down. "Max," James said gently, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay?" Max looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. "They said you don't really care about me, that you're just pretending because of the news." James's heart broke. He placed a hand on Max's shoulder. "That's not true, Max. I care about you more than anything. Don't ever doubt that." Max sniffled, his voice small. "Are you going to leave?" "Never," James said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." That night, James sat with Sophie in her living room, the weight of the day still heavy on him. "Kids can be cruel," Sophie said softly, glancing at Max, who had fallen asleep on the couch. "I'm worried this will follow him," James admitted, "that my mistakes will make his life harder." Sophie shook her head. "You can't protect him from everything, James. But you can be there for him when things get tough. That's what he needs." James nodded, her words sinking in. For the first time, he felt like he was starting to understand what it meant to be a father. The quiet hum of the city's nightlife filled the air as James sat in Sophie's modest living room. Max had fallen asleep on the couch, his sketchbook lying open beside him. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The events of the week had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "You're doing better than you think," Sophie said softly, her voice breaking the silence. James turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You've been here," she continued, "even when things got messy. That's more than I expected when you showed up at the diner." James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I keep wondering if I'm doing enough. If I'm enough." Sophie leaned back, her expression contemplative. "You can't erase the past, James. But you're here now. And that's what Max needs. He doesn't care about your business or your mistakes. He cares about you showing up." Her words struck a chord. James had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself through achievements, but Max didn't need any of that. All he needed was a father who wouldn't walk away. The next morning, James arrived early at Sophie's apartment, carrying a small box. Max opened the door, his face lighting up when he saw his dad. "What's that?" Max asked, pointing to the box. James smiled. "It's for you. Open it." Max tore into the packaging, revealing a model of the Europa Lander, a spacecraft designed to explore the icy moon of Jupiter. "Whoa!" Max exclaimed, his eyes wide. "This is awesome. I thought we could build it together," James said, crouching to Max's level. Max grinned. "Yeah, let's do it." They spent the morning assembling the intricate model, Max peppering James with questions about space exploration. By the time they finished, the lander stood proudly on the coffee table, a symbol of their growing bond. "You know," James said, ruffling Max's hair, "one day, you might be the one designing the real thing." Max beamed, his confidence bolstered by his father's encouragement. As the weeks passed, James's presence in Max's life became a steady constant. He attended school events, helped with homework, and even joined Sophie and Max for dinner regularly. Slowly, the walls between him and Sophie began to crumble. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Sophie's apartment, James turned to her, his expression serious. "There's something I've been meaning to say." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." James chuckled softly. "It's not. I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for Max. You've raised him into an incredible kid, and I don't take that for granted." Sophie's expression softened. "Thank you. That means a lot." James hesitated before continuing. "I also want you to know that I'm committed to this, to him, to being part of his life. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm not going anywhere." Sophie studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. Finally, she nodded. "You've come a long way, James. I'll admit, I didn't think you'd stick around, but I was wrong." Her admission felt like a victory, a sign that the trust he'd been working so hard to build was finally taking root. The next day, James surprised Max by picking him up early from school. "Where are we going?" Max asked as they drove through the city. "It's a surprise," James said with a smile. They arrived at the planetarium, a place Max had always wanted to visit. As they stepped inside, Max's excitement was palpable. "This is so cool," he exclaimed, running ahead to look at the exhibits. James followed, watching his son with a sense of pride he couldn't put into words. During the planetarium's main show, Max leaned against James, his eyes glued to the projection of the stars above. "Thanks for bringing me here, Dad," Max said softly. James placed a hand on his shoulder. "Anytime, Max." That evening, back at Sophie's apartment, James lingered at the door after saying goodnight to Max. Sophie joined him, her expression thoughtful. "He's happy," she said. James nodded. "I hope so. That's all I want. For him to be happy and know he's loved." "You're doing a good job," Sophie said quietly. "Better than I expected." James smiled. "Coming from you, that means a lot." As he left, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he truly believed that they were becoming a family. The evening air was crisp as James stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. For the first time in years, the towering skyline felt less like a monument to his success and more like a backdrop to something greater. Max and Sophie had given him a reason to look beyond the walls of his empire. He had spent weeks mulling over his next steps. Building a connection with Max had brought him closer to Sophie than he ever thought possible, but he knew there was still a lingering distance between them, a hesitation rooted in the pain of their shared past. James reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple but elegant ring, the kind Sophie would appreciate for its understated beauty. He closed the box with a decisive click, his resolve hardening. The next day, James arrived at Sophie's apartment with a calm exterior, though his heart raced beneath the surface. Max greeted him at the door, his grin wide. "Hey, Dad, come see what I drew," Max said, tugging on James's sleeve. James let himself be pulled into the living room, where Max proudly displayed a new sketch of Europa's surface, complete with imagined alien life forms. "This is incredible, Max," James said, ruffling his son's hair. Sophie appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. "He's been working on that all morning," she said with a smile. "I can tell," James replied, standing. "Actually, Sophie, could I talk to you for a minute?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Sure." They stepped out onto the small balcony, the sound of distant traffic filling the space. Sophie leaned against the railing, her arms crossed. "What's on your mind?" she asked. James took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything we've been through. And I know I've made mistakes, but I also know I don't want to lose what we've built." Sophie's brow furrowed, her expression wary. "James." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the velvet box and holding out to her. "Sophie, I love you. I always have. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you and Max deserve. Will you marry me?" Sophie stared at the ring, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the air between them was heavy with silence. Then, she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. James's heart sank, but he nodded. "Take your time. I don't need an answer right now. I just needed you to know how I feel." Days passed after James's proposal, and though Sophie hadn't given him an answer, their interactions remained warm. Max, oblivious to the tension, continued to thrive, his confidence growing with every passing day. One evening, Sophie invited James to join them for dinner. As they sat around the table, the atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and conversation. After Max had gone to bed, Sophie and James sat together on the couch, sipping coffee. I've been thinking about what you said, Sophie began, her tone hesitant. James set his mug down, his attention fully on her. I never thought we'd end up here, she continued. When you walked back into my life, I didn't think I could trust you again. But you've shown me that you're serious, not just about Max, but about us. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't want to let fear hold me back anymore. The answer is yes, James. I'll marry you. Relief and joy surged through James as he reached for her hand. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise I won't let you down. Their wedding was a simple but beautiful affair, held in a small garden surrounded by close friends and family. Max stood proudly as the ring bearer, his grin lighting up the ceremony. As James and Sophie exchanged vows, the weight of their journey seemed to fall away, replaced by the promise of a future built on love, trust, and resilience. That evening, as the three of them sat together under the stars, Max leaned against James, his voice sleepy but content. Are we a real family now? Max asked. James wrapped an arm around him, his heart full. We always were, he said. Sophie smiled, her hand resting on James's. Together, they looked up at the sky, the future stretching before them like an endless constellation of possibilities. Thank you for watching. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps us continue creating more engaging content. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the story had the greatest impact on you? Was it a particular moment, a character, or the overall message? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Additionally, we're always looking for fresh ideas. If there's a story you'd like to see featured on the channel, let us know in the comments. Your suggestion could inspire our next video. Thank you for being a valued part of our community. Stay tuned for more compelling stories.